Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 26th, just in time for Halloween. And I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And this week we have a spooky, well, it's not that spooky. It's actually really fascinating episode for you. But before we dive into it, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week and continue to make Talk Nerdy free to download for each and every person who's interested in listening. If you want to support the show, just visit patreon.com/talknerdy, and you can become a part of this amazing group of people who include Michael Gaucher, Mary Neva, Christopher Pitts, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitas, Charles Payet, Brian Holden, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Daniel Lang, David J. E. Smith, Robert Christ, and of course, Elise Christie. Thank you all so very much. All right, so we had the opportunity this week to hear from Megan Rosenbloom once again. You guys may remember that she was on my show many moons ago, and we talked an awful lot about the death positive movement. We also talked a bit about library science, and she continues along, those traditions. She's currently working as a collection strategies librarian at UCLA Library here in LA. She, used to work as a medical librarian. And gosh, she has so many cool things that she does in addition to her core work. She's the obituary editor of the Journal of the Medical Library Association and the president of the Southern California Society for the History of Medicine. And of course, she's the co-founder and director of Death Salon, which is the arm of the Order of the Good Death that puts on events. And as I mentioned, a leader in the death positive movement. But we're going to talk about a unique, maybe I should say, perhaps eccentric, but I think absolutely fascinating interest of Megan's. And she wrote a whole book about it. It's called Dark Archives, A Librarian's Investigation into the Science and History of Books Bound in Human Skin. Yes, human skin. So without any further ado, let's get into it, guys. Here she is, Megan Rosenbloom. Megan, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sad we can't be doing this in person.
I know, Cara, I miss your dog.
Oh, yeah, he's the best. He's still going strong, even though he's 10 now. So, I think I have a few solid years left with him. But as we will be talking about death, I'm sure, during this conversation, it's definitely something I've been thinking about a lot lately is, how short our pets' lives are and how much we have to squeeze the experiences out of it while we can.
For sure. Yeah. I will say during pandemic, man, am I missing having a pet. I had a cat for 16 years and she died a little bit before, I got pregnant and had a kid. And my kid's almost 4 now, but I'm just kind of waiting for when I feel like she's past the point where she might be a little too rough or whatever, right, to get a cat or a dog or a cat and a dog or whatever. But it would be really nice to have a pet right now, I feel like.
Yeah, it's definitely, for me, it's been hugely, psychologically beneficial. But at the same time, I live alone. So it's like, I can't even imagine what it would be like without my dog. You at least do have your partner and your child. And so you've got at least some of that additional kind of snuggle support. But just that lack of contact, I think, would be really, really hard for me. My dog is submitted to mandatory love time all the time. So he seems to be pretty good with it.
Yeah, it's funny. At least I do get walks because I take my kid out for a little walk in the morning, pretty much every day, which is good for both of us. We just kind of explore the neighborhood a little bit and do that. But yeah, mandatory love time goes both ways. It's really great to, have a kid to play with and do fun stuff with. And then, but on my way out to do this interview, she was just not wanting to eat her lunch and fighting with us and stuff. And then she just literally wrapped herself around my legs and was like, don't go.
No. And then how do you go? Oh, I see. Now I feel so guilty for putting you in that position. I cannot imagine those big doe eyes of a child being like, Mommy, don't leave. I'd be like, I'll give you everything.
I was literally going like 10 steps from the house to the garage. It is not like I'm going off to war in a foreign land or something like that.
It's all the same to them.
She'll
I
be
feel like
all right.
when I walk across the street to go to like Target to get something, if I'm, out of milk or something, I'll usually walk instead of jumping in my car so that I can keep a semblance of being healthy. And it's so bananas because I'll come home and literally Killer will act like I've been gone for a year. Like he will act like, oh, I didn't think you were ever coming back. I'm freaking out. And it's like, really, dude, I was gone 10 minutes. Calm down. That's what they do, though. We love it.
Yeah.
It makes us feel very special.
That is true, for sure.
Well, Megan, I'm super excited to be able to talk to you about a new book that you have out. Before we get into the very specifics of this very cool and to some extent niche, but also I think universal interest that you have, I thought it might be good for people who maybe have joined the podcast later in its evolution, who maybe didn't hear our original interview, to talk a little bit generally about what it is you do for a living, because you're a librarian. And I don't know if a lot of people think much about library science or the fact that librarians are like trained professionals who have a very interesting and unique job. I think we have a leave it to Beaver kind of mentality when it comes to library science. We remember librarians from, 50s television, but we don't think that, of course, active libraries have librarians working in them, and they studied library science.
Yeah. So, one thing that you find with certain professions where people are like, wow, you really had to get a master's degree to do that. And, I didn't really think about that, is that those jobs were usually held by women. So, people tend to devalue things like nursing and librarianship because it's a predominantly, female or woman field and still is. Still pretty, I think, I want to say some like 80% women or something like that. It's pretty, yeah. So, but there are as many different library kinds of jobs as you can really imagine, because each sort of library, like a public library versus the one you might find in a, school, like an elementary school versus, a lot of different kinds of special libraries. And for most of my career, I was working in an academic medical library, which is a sort of special library. And then just the general sort of college, university academic library, all of those, the realities of each of librarians in each of those spaces is extremely different. And then there are all these like very specific roles within them. So it's a pretty big universe. And my work is maybe more niche and unusual than most, but it's more because of my research interest and not necessarily my day-to-day. So when I was at the University of Southern California, most of my career as a medical librarian, we were faculty there. So I had to do all the things that faculty were expected to do, the professional service and publishing, and went up for the librarian equivalent of tenure and got that and things like that. So you were always expected to serve in, professional capacities and stuff. And then now that I'm at UCLA, I'm not a medical librarian anymore, but we're still expected to do those things, but you're not technically, considered faculty. So it really depends. But because the job was one that, required you to do things like publish and a lot of librarians in roles like that tend to develop, research interests. And mine came about weird and slowly over time in a way that I didn't expect. Like no one sets out to be like, I'm going to be the human skin book lady. That's not like a thing that people, it's like, what do you want to be when you grow up kind of thing. It's like not on the list. It's not a color of your parachute or whatever they call it. But yeah, if you sort of reverse engineer that, you could see how I kind of got there, I guess. Little kid, obsessed with writing, always wanted to write a book. And and, always saw myself as a writer. And then I became a journalist and was a journalist working at an NPR station in Philadelphia. And then at one point, I did a story on librarians and the Patriot Act and the sort of political kind of librarian political response to some of the, stipulations of the Patriot Act. And then I was thinking, oh, these people seem like my people. Like, I get this. And then when I decided that it didn't seem like journalism was going to be a viable full-time career that got me a paycheck and health benefits and stuff, because I was a bit maybe prescient on that regard. I thought, oh, well, maybe I could go back to school and become a librarian, because I just really liked the librarians I talked to, and I felt like our skill set was really kind of similar, where you like to know a little about a lot, and you'd like to try to help people find information in a way that can be useful to them. And so that was sort of my initial interest. And then, but going to library school remotely back then, there wasn't a way to really like specialize in rare books, which was something I was already, starting to get interested in. So I just tried to find other ways to, learn about them. And then I was a docent at this museum called the Rosenbach Museum, which is like rare book museum in Philadelphia. And one day I was doing a shift there, and then I walked over to the Mutter Museum. And the Mutter Museum is this like 19th century just beautiful like brass and velvety carpet and glass wood cases and everything. And it's just filled with body parts of, unusual representations of diseases and, congenital, abnormalities and things like that. And I always found the place really interesting and weird. And I was there one day and I saw among all of these like really unusual, dead bodies were just some books with their covers closed in a case. And I was like, these aren't even that interesting. Like, they're just brown. They're not like pretty looking books. They're not jeweled bindings or embroidered or anything like that. So why are they in here? And then I read the description and it said that they were bound in human skin by doctors. And I was like, what? and I was sort of like looking around, like, is someone else aware of this? This is not okay. It's like,
Which, like, to be fair, a lot of stuff in the Mutter Museum makes me feel that way.
Right. But, it makes sense if you're like looking at the colon that's like 6 feet long or something like that. But it's just these books were the thing that really kind of repulsed and fascinated me. And like many things in the Mutter, I kind of thought that they were the only ones. But then, I went to finish library school, got the job in LA, moved and started getting involved in the death positive movement and, sort of interacting with our mortality, and then kind of getting interested in the way that our mortality is sort of expressed in library collections. And I was researching another topic and traveling around, but I would ask people, do you happen to have like any human skin books? And a surprising number of them would be like, oh yeah, I think we do, but I'm not sure. Or the campus tour guide says we do, but I don't think we do. And I was just kind of surprised how many libraries were like, oh yeah, I don't know. I think so, maybe. And I was like, really? Because I took a rare book cataloging course, and it was there that I mentioned the ones I saw at the Mutter, and they were like, yeah, I think we have one of those. And I was like, what?
Wow, that surprises me too. I would think that it would be something that like, A, people would know exactly the answer to that question. Not like, I think so, but maybe, I don't know. And B, you would think that they would all be, I don't know. You would just think that there aren't that many of them.
Right. So that's where I was like, okay, this is weird. And then it was right around that time that there was a, news story that came out of Harvard that was like, they had tested a book. They tested Harvard's 3 alleged skin books, and they found out 2 of them were fake, and that one of them was real. And it was this big kerfluffle in the library land because some people were like, this is disgusting. Harvard should bury these books and whatever. And I was like, wow, this is interesting because this is something, they found a way to test these books. And we now know something that we didn't know the day before the test came in, which is that 2 books that we thought for, hundreds of years were human skin are not. But then there is definitely at least one real human skin book. And I met with the chemist who had done that test for Harvard. His name is Daniel Kirby. And I talked to him, I interviewed him about the process and how it works. And then we started kind of comparing notes about books we had heard of. And I was traveling around. And then, next thing I know, we're just kind of sending emails. Oh, have you heard about this one yet? Or I heard about that one. And then he tested the books at the Mutter and found that they have the largest collection of verified human skin books in the world at 5.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And so the Mutter curator, now director, Anna Doty, started talking to us about other ones. And then we just kind of formed a sort of multidisciplinary scientific team to be like, okay, let's build a database. Let's find out how many rumors we've heard, in writing, in passing from people. And let's make a list of all the alleged human skin books we can find and see how many of them we can offer to do this test for to find out if they're real or fake. And so we started calling it the Anthropodermic Book Project. And so Daniel and another chemist, Richard Hark, have been doing the chemical analysis, which is peptide mass fingerprinting, and which is a very clean, easy way to find out whether a book is from human origin or a different animal. And I could tell you a little bit more about that. And so during the course of our work so far, we were originally just focused on doing books in public collections like libraries and museums. But now a lot of private collectors have been.
Yeah.
Oh, you should read my emails. I mean, I really do get emails at least once a week from people who have, and if I didn't think it could violate their privacy, people would find out who they were, I would totally do a dramatic reading of some of them because some of them are just really wild. But I mean, literally, I got one today that was offering a human skin book for auction. And
so I can't oh my God, I have a million questions, which we will get to, but I'm fascinated by even the legality around this.
Oh yeah, that's a whole interesting area.
But I got to know, how long then have you, so you mentioned the name of the project, which of course has to do with your specific interest area, which is books bound in human skin. And that, what did you call that again?
Yeah, it's anthropodermic bibliopegy. So anthropo.
Yeah, people.
Human. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Dermic.
Skin. Yep.
Biblio.
Book.
This one's hard. Pegi is
teaching, right? Or learning.
Oh no, that's pedagogy.
Oh, pedagogy. You're right.
It's PEGY is fasten, to fasten or to bind together.
Oh,
so
interesting.
Binding books in human skin.
Crazy. Okay, so how long has this project been going on then?
I think we started somewhere in 2015-ish. And so we've been going for, I guess, about 5 years now, which is kind of wild to think about. In public collections so far, we identified 50 potential human skin books. So that it wasn't just, I heard about this one, but we could actually narrow it down to an individual copy that exists. And we tested 31 of them so far, and 18 of them have proven to be human, and 13 have been proven to be a different animal.
Okay. All right.
But we've also tested some non-book objects. We've tested some private collection, books, and we get private inquiries all the time. And so I'm actually working back through, because I wasn't keeping, track of the private ones, but since we get more and more of them all the time, and I have a feeling I'm going to get a lot more emails after the book comes out, that I want to start tracking those too, because I think a lot of them, especially in certain countries like France, where it's pretty expressly illegal to be owning a human skin book, that there are a lot more in private hands and it's sort of more underground.
Right, right. So yeah, the investigation might have to be a little bit more sophisticated. So you mentioned that in this kind of ongoing project that you're obviously working on it, other librarians, chemists, like how multidisciplinary is it? Like who's involved in the process?
So I'm the librarian, and I do a lot of also the historical sort of provenance research, like who owned it? Can we find out who was the person who, decided to get the book bound in human skin, because most of them were books that existed before and were rebound in human skin. Who was the doctor involved? Because there was almost always a doctor was the one who was actually getting the skin. Whether they were also the book collector or not, it varies, but there's some doctor somewhere in the story. And then when possible, which is a lot less common, try to figure out who the person might be whose skin was being used. So all of the stories around whose hands the book has passed through, both in its creation and its ownership, is something that I've been tracking. And that's a lot of the stories of the book are trying to kind of find the human elements of, like, the real human, touches behind the book, not just, oh, this is a creepy thing that exists, isn't this spooky, but more like there were real people involved in this, and what can we try to know about them? I had help. I had an intern briefly who helped me pick the database, to use, and help me populate it. And then I just kind of keep our records that way, and, data sharing forms and that kind of stuff. So that's a very librarianly organizational kind of stuff, in addition to the history stuff. Anna is our kind of person on the inside in museums. And she does a lot of work herself, where she works with her historical medical collections and doing different kinds of scientific interrogations with them to learn things that haven't been learned before. So, and she's got a background in forensic anthropology, so she's super, useful in that way too. And then our chemists who are the test is a proteomics test. So it's really just taking an extremely tiny portion of the leather binding. If you can see it with your eye, it's totally big enough. And then digesting it in trypsin, and then running it through a mass spectrometer, and then comparing the sort of peaks and valleys of what comes out of the protein, comparing the protein to different animal families, and then trying to see, does this look like a sheep or a goat or a great ape?
Right. Would you be able to tell the difference between like a book bound in chimpanzee skin and a book bound in human skin?
See, that's the big question, right? So some of what Daniel has, because I'm not the scientist and not running the tests or anything, but the way he's explained it to me is that a lot of it depends on the robustness of the library of kind of samples that they have, and how different the different species are from one another. So some species are really close to each other and some are further away. So even though sheep and goat and cows are all bovidae family, or however you say that, bovidae, like bovines, that they're far enough away in the evolutionary tree that they're easier to distinguish from each other because it's not DNA. DNA tends to degrade pretty quickly after death, but especially when something has been subjected to a lot of chemical changes like leather processing.
So, right, because it's tanned. It's not just like slap the skin on there. There's a whole process to make it not rot.
Right. And it's that process that makes the DNA really hard to keep. Whereas like something like parchment or some of the other things that you find, there's amazing advances going on all the time in ancient DNA, but it's the leather processing part that makes it a lot less likely for it to stick around. But collagen sticks around for thousands and thousands of years, pretty much no matter what you do to it, and that is why that's the thing that we test, but we can't get like as specific. So yeah, I've yet to hear of any book that might be bound in like a chimpanzee or a gorilla, but I would really love to encounter one if it existed, just to try to see what our test would come up with and whether it looked like a human false positive or not.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I mean, it's something that I feel like in the backs of our minds, everybody kind of had at least a wives' tale knowledge that it existed, that there are out there books bound in human flesh. I'm not sure how much most skeptical thinkers would give credence to the idea that it's real or that it's like a mythology. But of course, there are, as you have made very clear, several books bound in human flesh in collections throughout the world. And so I guess the question that follows, like the most obvious one, is when did this start and why did it start? Like what was going on here?
Yeah. So the rumors of books bound in human skin really kind of began at the same time that clinical medicine began, which is the French Revolution.
Okay.
So, before then, so there started being these rumors of these kind of revolutionaries who were doing despicable things like making human skin culottes and binding, copies, having cemetery balls where they give out human skin bound copies of the rights of man and stuff like that. Right. So a lot of this is like royalist propaganda, we know now, but these were rumors that were going on, and it was a really pretty wild and bloody time. So a lot of atrocities really did take place. So I don't think they were really scrutinized that much about these claims. But there was this, idea of this tannery at Moudon, which was like cranking out human skin books and stuff like that in this old castle, in this hunting castle. Yeah. So that was like where the rumors really started. And for hundreds of years, people just kind of repeated them as true. Thus far, any book from that era that we've found and have been able to test has not proven to be true. I don't know for sure if there are any from that era or not. But anyone that we find, of course, if we can test it, I would love to know if there's even one that actually derives from the era. But the reason why I mention it in relation to clinical medicine is because then, before this time period, medical practice was really a lot more, maybe you work for a family or a couple people and you just, you didn't really train in a scientific way. It was more like an apprenticeship to be a doctor. You didn't have to have any sort of scientific training of any kind. And you didn't even encounter that many patients. And so during the French Revolution, even though a lot of other crafts or professions got more like deprofessionalized so that more people could do them, medicine got more rigorous.
Right.
And they had this idea of, these charity hospitals where the poor basically go to die, because if you were not poor, you would not go to a charity hospital. You would have your own like private doctor. That maybe these charity hospitals could be places that medical students could learn by seeing lots of different patients. And then you see different, presentations of diseases and whatever. And then you also need to learn certain scientific, have a certain scientific, take certain classes, and then also learn by dissecting dead human bodies to learn how organs and things work in a body. And so all of these things made medicine a lot more rigorous and more uniform, and invariably definitely improved, medical science. But part of a weird side effect of that is that they went from, just dealing on a person-to-person basis to seeing like lots and lots of patients. And if doctors are like running around a clinic and just, okay, what's going on with this liver, or this, like, okay, we got a case of, syphilis here or something like that, then if a doctor isn't like actively working to check in with themselves to sort of check in with the humanity of the patients that they're dealing with, it's what can happen is you get this sort of what Michel Foucault called the clinical gaze, where you're really looking at a person more in terms of their body parts or their diseases as like problems to be solved, and not really thinking about the person that you are interacting with. And to a certain extent, all clinicians, I mean, I'm sure you have experience with this, to a certain extent, everybody has to do that, because you can't get completely wrapped up in the lives of every single patient, because you have people die and stuff and you wouldn't be able to do your job. But there has to be a line where you still like maintain that sort of understanding that you're working with real human beings. And, what's the worst that can happen if you lose track of that? This is kind of the worst thing that can happen. It's like, so as clinical medicines really, progressed, and doctors were also becoming like higher stature people in society, and started doing sort of gentlemanly things like collecting art and especially collecting books, then when they were dissecting people, some doctors, and not just, creepy kind of serial killer Hannibal doctors, but real respectable doctors, didn't have any compunction about, saving a piece of skin to bind a special book and make it that much more like rare and valuable. And that's where a lot of these books come from. And that was in the 19th century in America, and in, some of the other Western countries like England and France and stuff so far.
Wow. So they're not as old as I kind of assumed that they would have been.
Yeah, there's some that have, that like the books themselves have really, really old dates, because they might be, I have this book that is, the 17th century midwifery book, and then I rebound it in skin in the 19th century, because that's my oldest, most like prized book or something like that. So the oldest alleged ones that I've come across that I've not been able to test, and probably never will, are in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and they're like 13th century Bibles.
Okay.
But they probably won't ever submit to like me taking a little piece off of that because of how incredibly old they are. But I did get to hold them and look at them and everything. It was pretty amazing. But they're also completely out of step with like the rest of what I know so far about human skin books. But you never know.
Which is funny, because it to me seems like, oh, okay, like a super old Bible, like I could see some sort of like spiritual rationalization or some sort of like mystical kind of reasoning behind making a Bible out of human flesh, whether that was a person who was like a great prophet, or whether it was, like some sort of traditional ritualistic reason for this. Like, I think it fits in with our kind of conception of lore. And what's interesting is that it sounds like what you're telling me is that more often it was just like physicians who were like, oh, I don't know, the skin is nice and clean. It would make for a nice book. I'm just going to cut that off their back real quick before we bury them.
I think it's more like, oh, your Morocco leather copy is really nice, but I have access to something that would make this way more unusual. Like, oh, it's bound in the skin of a woman or something like that. it's really hard.
But like who the person was didn't really seem to matter.
Not so much. There's a few times where they mention, you know, a person being a woman, for instance, because the book has to do with, you know, midwifery or something like that. There are books that we haven't tested. There's sort of like a school of them in England, which were made for a different reason. And they were executed prisoners. And this was part of their punishment, was all of the dissecting and also, you know, binding, say, a trial transcript of their horrible murder trial in their own skin as a part of a punishment. And so those are really interesting because although we haven't tested those yet, they have like, you would actually know who the person was if it turns out to be real, you know? And,
right, because the provenance is in the book itself.
Yeah, and then you have this whole story about them, but the story is like what they got caught doing or alleged to have done, you know, and this whole, the gaze, again, is from like law enforcement, not, you know, but yeah, there's one book at in Boston at the Athenaeum, which is a prisoner book, but he actually requested that he gave his own life story and had it bound, asked for it to be bound in his own skin. So that one's really interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because you can really hear, he's the only person that we can really know from his own words. And it's so fascinating because he's just like kind of charming, you know, swashbuckling sort of, you know, roguish petty thief kind of guy. And so he has a whole chapter in my book because I thought it was really important for us to hear from him, you know, as much as possible, since so many of these people will never know who they were.
Right. Because I mean, one of the things that modern anthropology and social sciences have really been teaching us is that we know that history is written by kind of like the people in power. And so even in these stories where, like you said, these were, quote, criminals who part of their punishment was that they might be bound in flesh and it's got the proceedings of their trial. Like there's really no way to know if they got a fair trial, if these representations of them are accurate, if these individuals weren't victims, especially if they were, you know, in poverty or they were kind of considered a lower socioeconomic class, different race, you know, things like that. Women.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the racial element, because I get asked about this a lot, is I wrote a chapter about it, and there aren't many alleged human skin books that have for which we know like the race of the person.
Okay, yeah, because after they're tanned, like, would you be able to tell at all?
It could be any color at all. And so just because it's, you know, say it's dark, you know, it's just dyed dark, all skin would look the same. Because your epidermis is, I mean, your dermis is like the same color, no matter what your epidermis color is. So if you ever see like forensic pictures of people's tattoos after death, and stuff like that, where if you take off the first layer of skin and you see the dermis, your tattoo, and some of these preserved tattoos, like if a Black person had their tattoo preserved, it would look like it was on white skin.
Right.
Which is kind of just mind-boggling, right? In a certain way, but it's not what we would normally think, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, because all the melanocytes are obviously coming into contact with the sun. So the deeper skin is doesn't have that cell type in it.
Right, exactly. So it's so yeah, this is like, you know, there's no way of looking at something and being like, oh, this is clearly the skin of a certain, you know, color person or something. But the ones thus far, the ones that have mentioned some sort of ethnic background that we have tested have all been fake.
Oh, interesting. Wow. Okay. So there's really a real lack of evidence or provenance around where some of these people have come from, unless it was well documented within kind of the medical establishment.
Right. So we know that, you know, Black people, for instance, were overrepresented on the anatomist table. And so it is quite possible some of these books were originally from people of color, but we don't have if we don't have the provenance of who the person was, there's no way to even test for that to find out. So it's
I think that my kind of initial instinct, sadly, and maybe that, is a more reflection of the state of the world or my relationship to the state of the world, but is that, every book bound in human flesh is probably highly controversial, and they were probably all taken without consent. And, these were mostly vulnerable people. And I think that just comes from a deeper understanding of kind of the way that power dynamics have occurred throughout history. And so I don't know why, or I do know why, but my assumption would be that in the vast majority of these books would have been made without the consent of the individual involved. But is that even something that you guys are starting to get an understanding of?
Right. So that is why this is what I would call like a truly controversial topic, as opposed to something like evolution, which is not really controversial.
Right.
Like people call it like teach the controversy. It's like, no, it's not really a controversy. Like everyone who knows anything about it agrees with a certain side of that. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
But this is actually honestly controversial in that people have very reasonable differences of opinion about what should be done with this kind of thing. And that was part of what was fascinating to me too, and I try to really show that in the book, because I talk to a lot, I travel around and I talk to a lot of the people who work with these books and are, custodians of them. And there's a real variety of reactions about how people feel about them. Like, are they fascinated? Are they repulsed? Do they think they should be destroyed? There's a real gamut, I think.
Right. And who owns them? Like if this is an indigenous person's skin, or this is, a descendant of slaves, or this is or an actual slave skin, does this go back to the family? Should it go back to, the community? Or do we even know enough to know who should be the rightful owner of these things?
Given the time period, they're probably not people who are from a certain, we would never be able to distinguish, say, a tribe or, something like that. Or even if there's no provenance information about who the individual was, we can't even go that far. Right. So it's a little different than a museum wanting to repatriate, human remains that are clearly from a certain, group of people in a certain place and time, right?
Right. But it's almost like a different level of plunder, you know what I mean? Because it's so much more surgical, no pun intended, but really it was a very specific choice that somebody, unless there is documentation, and even then it would be questionable about coercion and about authenticity, you cannot consent to your skin being used if you're not alive to consent, And so that becomes a really complicated issue ethically.
And it's so, that idea to us is so disturbing. However, it's also kind of out of time. Because at the time that these books were created, medical consent didn't really exist.
Right.
The idea that you would have, consent over what happens to you and what happens to your dead body is there was no legal standing for consent or anything like that. Consent is something that's so incredibly important to us today, but people didn't really think about it that way. You might be totally disgusted to find out something like this happened, if you would even find that out. But I really think that it's just kind of, there's a lot about the different circles of knowledge and influence and power, and what certain people felt okay about, and whether other people knew about it or not.
Right. Yeah. It seems like it was a very a very secretive and dark time, especially if you were unfortunate enough to be in a position where you had very little power, because you probably had very minimal rights. Whereas today we could see that somebody's rights are being trampled and say this is an outrage and what can we do legally to push against it. Historically, it's like, yep, that's the way it is.
Yeah, and you wouldn't even necessarily like know something like that happened. And I really get into the whole like how bodies were sourced for anatomical learning thing.
Right.
And the way that the laws changed around that time to make more bodies available, because people were body snatching and digging up graves and stuff routinely in order to meet this need of medical education. So it's a really fascinating history. I mean, there's been a lot of other books written just on that. But
right.
How that impacted some of the laws in different countries around the way that human bodies are treated and the way that, medicine's relationship with the body. But, some of what comes up is basically that, oh, well, what we have learned is that when people learn what is necessary to do medical education, they find it distasteful. So it's better that we just kind of don't really bring it up to them.
Wow.
So there's this real in-group, out-group kind of thing. And so that's the kind of thing where it's like you could, it is a murky, uncomfortable history. And I think that these books, because they have been able to continue to exist, new things have come up that have allowed us to learn more about them. And then, but they also like they're evidence of a thing that happened, routinely enough, not just one or two people, but enough that there are, 50 alleged books in public collections and who knows how many more around the world that, if they were destroyed at some point, then how would we be able to know that? And we don't, how would we be able to interrogate them with the kind of lenses that we look at things today and like learn that about our history? Because it would be easy to just dismiss these things as, oh, there used to be rumors about this, but that was probably not real.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think obviously I sort of understand, although I do question its efficacy, the idea of, for example, destroying ivory to try and prevent a black market trade. But I think this is, like you said, it's a really different situation. Like destroying it simply to erase history, unfortunately, is sort of what it would do. In a black market trade, I'm not sure that there's like this really big push to anymore to kill people just to bind books in their skin. I'm not sure if that ever was like a massive kind of motivation. But
as far as we know, they didn't kill anyone to bind. Well, if you want to say the prisoners were killed and then also bound,
right?
But it wasn't expressly for the skin. It
was more like a trophy after the fact.
Yeah, and but people were killed, like the Burke and Hare murders in Scotland, which, definitely impacted the laws in Britain afterward. The Burke and Hare murders, they killed, over a dozen, I think like 15 or 16 people to sell their bodies to anatomists for dissection. None of those bodies became a human skin book, but that murderer, Burke, allegedly did become a human skin book.
Interesting. Wow. I mean, and then it makes you wonder, and you've probably done some digging into this. So fast forward to today, where all of these ethical complications of not just consent, but power and kind of paternalism and legality come together. And so if you, for example, have a human skin book because it was your grandfather's 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 and it's just been in your family, is it legal to sell that book at auction? It seems like that would create some sort of weird perverse incentivization. Or is there, because they're so old, is it grandfathered in that like, yeah, you can sell this, but like modern, you can't sell modern body parts, for example?
Yeah, it's really fascinating because the laws are totally different depending on where you are, and in ways that I just found really interesting. So I sort of geeked out on it a little bit. Like, okay, if we wanted, if we wanted to, I have a chapter and it's just like, if we wanted to, I think I called it My Corpse, My Choice, if I'm not mistaken, but it was sort of like, I took the closest thing that I knew about that would be similar today, that for some reason grosses people out less, is the tattoo preservation idea.
Oh, right. So like if I die and my family wants to remember, can they like cut my tattoo off my arm and save it?
Yeah. So that has gotten, there are a few outfits that are doing this, right? Mm-hmm. And the big question is this legal? And in the United States, with the exception of Native American remains, which are covered by NAGPRA, which is like, the only federal law that actually governs human remains. Everything else is based on state law. Mm-hmm. And the state laws vary about what you can do with a dead body, which is why, I'm part of the Order of the Good Death, and we have lobbied in different states to get certain disposition, technologies legalized. So, there's aquamation, which is like cremation, but with water. And that's legal in California now. It's legal in Washington, but it wasn't expressly legal before, Mm-hmm. But there are certain states where it's not, those things aren't legalized yet. But the interesting, if you want to do something like that, like if you want to have a new way of dealing with dead bodies available to people in the marketplace with their consent, there still needs to be some sort of usual, either like you go out and try to get that sort of affirmative consent, like we are making human composting legal and now you can do this. And so there's no question. But if you don't do that, then it's actually complaint-based. And the complaint-based would be if someone calls up and says, hey, this funeral home is doing this thing. And I think that is often what they call desecration of a corpse, right? Okay. But at different points of history, different places, cremation would have been desecration of a corpse. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of an autopsy could have been considered desecration of corpse at different time periods. So it's weirdly in the eye of the beholder, some of these things. And the only way to really, truly know if something is legal in the United States is often to like test it out. Like if someone brings a lawsuit against you, do you win or not for doing that? And that is a scary thing for people, because why would you want to be the one who tests that out? And then maybe that's your license on the line. Yeah. In other countries, and some of the other countries featured in the book, there are way more express like rules around things, like the Human Tissue Act in the UK, which I will, for this purpose, say the UK is like, England and Northern Ireland and
and Scotland and Wales.
Not England? Scotland.
So you're going to leave Scotland out of this.
I'm leaving Scotland out because they have even stricter rules.
Right, yeah, which is not uncommon sometimes. That they have kind of a secondary government kind of on top of the classic parliamentary government.
Right. So the rules in the Human Tissue Act are like really specific about what is considered human remains, that you can both like in terms of like, I think they say, I think a lot of it has to do with whether you can regrow it when you are alive. So if you can regrow hair or fingernails or something like that, then that is not considered like a human remain.
I
But
see.
if it's
Okay.
something like your skin, which you can't really regrow, then that would be considered like a human remain, right?
Mhm.
And so whether you are buying and selling human remains or something like that depends on what part of the body we're talking. But there are clauses, about what the age of certain items, kind of taking them off the table in terms of you getting in trouble as a museum or individual for owning a thing. In Scotland, it's like more specific and more strict, and France is strictest of all of those countries. So you're not really allowed to own anything that's a human, regardless of when it was made or through the application of skill. is one of the things. So it's like, is it just a body part in a cooler, or did you make a thing like a book or a shrunken head out of it?
Right. Is it a beautiful carved skull?
Like a shrunken head, like the toy Moko, would be considered an artifact instead of a human remain because there is an application of skill involved. So there's like really interesting kind of, you can really go down a real rabbit hole with this stuff about the ways that different countries view what this means. But I think it all just also comes down to the fact that, although we tend to have really, pretty visceral reactions to a story like this or an idea like this, that is legally, it's a lot grayer area than you might necessarily think.
Fascinating. I guess there's like a million questions and we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But one that has been kind of like eating away at the back of my mind this whole time is when we talk about the time scale, the individuals involved, the end product. Have you come across anything that's like modern? Like, what's the newest? I mean, we've kind of talked about the oldest, but what's the newest book bound in human skin that you've researched so far?
Well, in terms of the like 100% confirmed, yes, this is human skin, etc. That so there are some books by the first African American poet, woman poet, Phyllis Wheatley, that are in Cincinnati, and they are, although the book's edition is from 1773, I only found out, and I don't know, but I think I might have been the first person to like put all of this information together, but because I did an archive dive about the bookseller who had these books created, and I found an invoice for getting from the binder, that said using leather supplied. And it was in 1930, which is really late for this.
Wow.
So it's really hard to say how long the practice continued when people were using coded language, like using leather supplied, right? And then only after we test it do we know that it really was like somehow this bookseller got a hold of some human leather to make these books. And that's all part because she's a Black writer. I was kind of like, why would you bind multiple books by this, mother of Black American literature? Why would you do that? And the story was not really some, it's different than what you might anticipate. The reasons why he was actually like a great friend of Arthur Schomburg and really invested in trying to get people collecting Black literature in America. So but where, so that's interesting, but where did he get the skin? Like, what's the deal with that?
Right.
So it's really, there are some things that, we may never know about the reasoning behind here, but it's always kind of hard for us to put ourselves in these shoes, I think. And that, again, is part of what's fascinating to me, that many people were involved in doing these things and did not see this as some sort of like creepy abomination thing they were doing. That it was fine. It was okay. It was good. It was whatever.
And of course, now, as you mentioned before, this is a truly controversial topic. Do you personally, as somebody who's been investigating in this world for quite some time and who, of course, has a new book coming out just in time for Halloween, by the way, do you yourself get hate mail because of this? Do you deal with really strong emotional opinions, or do you find that the kind of general consensus or the general attitude is one more of just like a little bit of morbid curiosity?
I think that I've had individuals where if it comes up, like back when we used to go to parties, if it came up at a party or something, that some people would just like recoil and then also sort of transfer that idea of disgust to me, like that I'm disgusting for wanting to learn about something.
Right.
Disgusting, as if it's like, I'm not advocating getting like that we all go make human skin books or something, right? So like don't get that twisted about me, but just because it's repulsive and, morally suspect doesn't mean that it's not worth studying or knowing about, that it can't teach us things that we should know about our history, even if it's not a rosy bit of history, right? But I do get, like, sometimes we'll see what happens after the book actually publishes, if I get a bunch of people calling me a monster or something. But thus far, the people who have read the book, luckily, thankfully, get the spirit with which I am coming at this topic, right? That it's with a humane kind of lens that I look at these books, and that I treat them respectfully. And parts of the book are, actually kind of funny, but the joke is always on me, right? It's never me making fun of the people who are made into human skin books or anything, but maybe it's funny when I ruin my shoes in the tannery,
Right.
Like that kind of thing, like me bumbling around the world looking for human skin books and having weird encounters. I feel like if you feel like you know me, then you trust me to be your guide through this kind of dark space. And along the way, you learn a lot of things that you maybe, if it was just all doom and gloom, that you wouldn't feel able to like face it,
Right. I mean, I've seen comparisons for this new book to Mary Roach's Library, or even, for example, we just recently had on your colleague, Caitlin Doty, once again to the show. And I think she takes a similar approach, which is sort of like talking about very heavy, very dark things in a way that's simultaneously respectful of the people involved and respectful of the topic, but still, I think, provides an interesting space for absurdity and for humor and for, like we mentioned, morbid curiosity. And there is a way to do that and still be profoundly humanistic and profoundly respectful of the lives lost. It's a hard thing to navigate. So, like, kudos to you for being able to toe that line, because I'm sure that was a struggle as you were writing.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely wanted to make sure that, the parts that are kind of funny or kind of whatever, that who's am I punching up, or,
right.
Right. or punching myself, not,
punching in.
Stop hitting yourself. It's like that I feel good about and okay with. And like, I'm gratified thus far that those who have read it seem to get that. They get where the heart is there, and that, I do care. I wouldn't have spent, 5 years digging through these stories if I didn't care about the people that are being, that the stories are about. It's not just like one could have written a book about human skin books and just been like, oh, aren't these creepy? Ooh, spooky ooky, the end, and that I was not interested in telling the story. I was more interested in the actual human stories behind them. And I think that comes across, which is good. I'm glad that readers are getting that I care about it, and but yeah, like, you can totally see it is a skill, and it takes a lot of careful consideration for that balance between your approachability as a narrator and storyteller versus, whether someone could ever misconstrue your intention on that. And Caitlin is a total genius with that. She can talk about things, and on her YouTube videos especially, like she can talk about things that are so bizarre and she's so funny.
Right.
She's like incredibly funny, but it's always with this like totally human and respectful and never like punching down way. So I definitely she's my friend, but I also get like a lot of inspiration from the way that she handles things, because she handles difficult topics with like extraordinary flair, I think.
I love that. Oh, that's so cool to hear. And of course, people listening were just able to hear her episode, because as of us recording this today, it just came out yesterday. So interesting. Well, guys, the book is Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. Megan, before we say adieu, I would love to follow up. I don't even remember the last time you were on the show. I don't even remember if I was closing with my what have come to be kind of my consistent final 2 questions. So I don't know what you would have said at the time, but I would love to get a fresh perspective and ask you my closing 2 questions.
Okay, lay them on me.
All right. So I want you to think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you right now. And of course, that could be far-reaching because we are living in unprecedented times. Number 1, I'd love to hear from you. What is the thing that's keeping you up at night? The thing that you're most concerned about, maybe kind of, I don't know, pessimistic about. But then on the flip side of that, so we end on a lighter note, what are you genuinely looking forward to? Where do you find your optimism?
Keeping me up at night is like, I almost just want to like gestures broadly, all this. All of it keeps me up at night. But I think in particular, the election keeps me up at night. And also, as an aside, it's just it is completely bizarre to be trying to promote my first, book that comes out 2 weeks before this election. And so anyone who, like you, who are interested in the topic enough to like talk about it with me or read the book or whatever, I'm just so extra grateful for that, because it's kind of like, hey, everything is terrifying. Do you want to hear about something horrible you didn't even know about before?
But also fascinating.
It's like you could be totally freaked out about something else too.
Or maybe it will just distract you from what's going on right now, because there is this kind of historical contextualization.
Yeah, that I hope so. So those who are able to find it in their hearts and reading spaces to kind of to engage with this at this particular juncture, I'm just like, wow, thank you so much for that. And I hope that it does something good for you and makes, that you learn something new in a way that is at least somewhat enjoyable while everything is literally on fire here in Los Angeles and figuratively on fire elsewhere. So in terms of what am I looking forward to? I mean, it's still kind of surreal to think that I have a book that like exists and that people will hold and read and have reactions to. And that is so amazing and exciting when I can even give myself a second to think about the reality of it. A few people have, said things about reading, early copies of the book that were so kind. And like, you mentioned Mary Roach before, but, she said, in addition to the blurb she gave the book, that she said the nicest things to me about it. And she's like one of my heroes, and
That's amazing. That
like that really kind nice. Of thing is like, yeah, the people who blurb the book are Caitlin Doty, my friend, Dr. Lindsay Fitzharris, who's a medical historian, Mary Roach, and Eric Larson. And if that's not a murderer's row of like amazing people who took the time to both read my book on PDF because there was no physical copies available, like to do that during pandemic, and say really nice things about it, like that's amazing. So for the people who like hearing from people who it speaks to in some way, and that now my book is a book that could be on a shelf, that is something that is something I look forward to, the reality of it finally,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, the book, once again, I know I said it before, but I'll say it again. It's Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. And no, this book is not actually bound in human skin. But yes, I think it makes a great gift. And maybe we should just start a trend of giving yourself or other people Halloween presents, because now would be the time to do it. You can pre-order it now. Megan, thank you so much for joining me on the show. This was fascinating.
Thank you so much, Cara.
Of course. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.